Hey everyone, this is Sina with another episode of Into the Bytecode. My guest today is Andrew Huang, the founder and CEO of Conduit. Conduit is a rollup as a service infrastructure provider. They're working with teams like Proof of Play, Zora, Mode Network, and others, so have a front row seat to how Ethereum is scaling today. So in this conversation, we talk about how application developers can architect their smart contracts so that they can scale on their own rollups. We talked about rollup economics, how Conduit actually works under the hood, the Conduit marketplace, and a bunch of other topics. I hope you enjoy.
I always return to this example, but there's this game that, the number one crypto game, Pirate Nation. And we're lucky to work with them at Conduit, and they're doing anywhere from 20 to 50 million gas a second for, 5,000 concurrent players, I think 6-figure DAUs. And even that is like, they're launching a second chain kind of, I guess at this point, when this releases, they'll already have done it, but in a couple of days. I kind of think there's just this insatiable demand for compute. And a lot of developers today are kind of stuck in that scarcity mindset of like, oh, that'll never work on chain. And I think it might take a new kind of builder. It might take revising that opinion. But I think once you have 50 to 100 million gas a second on a single chain, I think that enables unique opportunities.
I've heard you describe what you're working on as on-chain compute, right? As opposed to cloud compute or server compute. And I'm curious, like this question of building applications that uniquely leverage what's possible here and the scale that we increasingly have. When you think about these applications, are you envisioning things that are entirely on chain and, are crypto native applications? Or do you see a way in which on-chain compute starts kind of coexisting with cloud compute within the same applications? Like how do you see this like future world and the types of applications you're imagining in your own head?
Yeah, I think like Web 2 and Web 3 compute already coexist a lot. Like if you look at like the Uniswap front end, right, that's hosted probably on Vercel somewhere. I think it's really hard to believe that they won't coexist for a long time. I think it's a question of what part of the stacks do you bring on chain, right? And maybe this is the most critical part is like, I think the new primitive of like crypto is like the idea of self-custodying, or the fact that you can have essentially a neutral platform kind of govern the relationship between you and kind of the objects on chain in a way that's transparent and like encoded in the VM. And so some arbitrary party can't just come and like flip the rules on you, right? And so I think when you're talking about bringing more things on chain, I think bringing the pieces of your application that really matter, like even in the Pirate Nation case, it's like, when your character is moving around on the screen, that's not an on-chain transaction. But when your character like wins a battle or like, opens a loot box or something, that is on-chain. And that's recorded and transparent and fair, and they can't take that away from you. And so I think it's about finding the right pieces of the stack to put on-chain in a way that delivers on the promise of crypto, right? Which is like, you do get this transparency. You do get these kind of rules that are enforced by a blockchain that no one can come in and like kind of take your stuff from you. And I think what kind of on-chain compute actually scales is your ability to bring more of that on-chain, right? Because I think if you look at a Pirate Nation, it's like 1 million gas per transaction for them. And if you're capped at 2.5 million gas, which is like the gas target for a lot of these layer twos, you're doing 2.5 transactions per second. That's like, I don't know, like 10 players playing concurrently, or like maybe 100. And so it's only by kind of scaling this gas limit that you're actually able to start to see people kind of bring these experiences on chain in a way that just wasn't possible before. And so, yeah, I think to answer your question, I think it's about what pieces you want to bring on chain. I think, there are clearly things that Web 2 are better at today, like, hosting front ends or things like that. I think there are certainly projects you can use to try to decentralize some of that. But I think ultimately it's kind of going to be like how, like the rules of how these objects on chain can actually interact, how they can change hands, and how they can grow and kind of expand from there.
Yeah. Yeah, like we've had this order of magnitude cost reduction from mainnet to L2s, and that's enough to more casually kind of send transactions around. And we've all become a little bit more fluid with how we use blockchains, but I think if you get another couple orders of magnitude decrease from there, then it completely changes the sorts of things you can think about.
We definitely think so. I think like anytime you're talking about 10, 100x, 1000x,
Yeah.
and like this is the meme behind like gigagas. And I don't know that we're at gigagas yet. I think we're maybe at gigagas and like syncing a chain, not online performance. But I think once you start creeping towards there, we're at 50 to 100 today. How do we get even higher? I think it does actually enable new things to happen on chain in a way that is actually very competitive with the Web2 experience. And I think beyond talking about the gas limit for a single chain, Web2 doesn't like, there are vertical scaling limits here. Any Web2 application that gets big, like Facebook is running on billions of servers, right? And so I think naturally, I think there's kind of two dimensions here. There's one, how do you get more parallel on a single chain? So today, as you know, the EVM is like single threaded. There are potentially opportunities for parallelism there. It kind of ultimately depends on the state and kind of how you're using it. But can we design applications to take advantage of kind of a parallel EVM? And I think that design looks very different than how applications are designed today. And then two,
interesting. Like application developers need to kind of get into this parallel execution mindset, because you need to kind of like shard your state and be careful not to just like touch everything at once, because that can't be parallelized.
Exactly. So like if you touch the same storage slots and there's dependencies on transactions, that has to go serially. But if you're able to parallelize kind of the state access where they're touching independent sets of state, those can obviously kind of go in parallel. And so for I think apps have never had to think about this because like every EVM is serial today. But if you want to go even beyond like 100 million gas a second, like I think a very obvious win is like instead of executing these serially, like let's execute them in parallel. And so that requires rethinking from the ground up, kind of how do I design this? Maybe I need a shard kind of this contract set out. And then importantly, like how do these then interact with each other in a way that offers a unified kind of app experience? I think it's somewhat similar to what we're seeing like Proof of Play do, where they have one chain, now they're launching a second chain. There's going to be a third and fourth chain. And so not only do I distribute kind of the state across a single chain, but like multiple chains, and then creating a unified experience on top of that. And so ultimately, like, again, we're so early in the app design and like the techniques for how to actually scale an app with this new primitive that, I think what we're most excited by at Conduit is working with like the highest quality folks who are actually pushing the limits there and like working hand in hand with them. And I think if you believe that apps are going to stay single chain, that like parallel doesn't matter, I almost think like it's a little bit bearish on crypto because it's so limited in what you can do. And the bull case for crypto is we just bring tons more on chain, and these techniques are going to help us scale that.
Yeah. So thinking more about scaling from an application developer's perspective, I really like the kind of different options that you sketched out. So one is to have multiple L2s or multiple L3s, and that's a pretty straightforward mental model, right? I just kind of take different parts of larger chunks of my state and almost think of them as separate databases, basically. And then my product is responsible for weaving them together into a coherent user experience. The other thing is that I have I have state that maybe actually needs to be able to, an individual atomic transaction needs to be able to act across different parts of the state. And I'm kind of being intentional about how, you know, within the microstructure of how I'm writing data to that state to make sure that that's parallelizable. And this isn't possible on L1. And my understanding is because you kind of don't know in advance when you're executing a transaction what storage slots it's going to hit. And we don't have this notion of access lists, which is necessary for being able to do this. But do you think I guess one of the promises of L2 has been that we can kind of approach the design of the VM and the runtime from scratch and like introduce net new features like being able to know in advance what state a transaction is going to touch and like whether it can be parallelized. Is this like the sort of a thing that's uniquely possible now that we're on L2?
I think it's in theory anything that's possible in L2 is also within reason and possible in L1. It's mostly just is L1 kind of ossified and how hard is it to get changes in there? And I think maybe what we've seen is that it's kind of slow, and that's in some ways by design because there's I'd say security, uptime, reliability are really important for L1. And they're probably making the right trade-off there. I think traditionally there's just been a lot of fear on innovating on this area, and like in some ways, like major L2s, right? Their business model is like constraining compute so that they can charge more for it. And we kind of have the opposite kind of line of thinking, which is like we actually just want to enable as much on-chain compute as possible. As cheaply as possible. And so it's just kind of a different thinking of how to use the technology. But I think, generally you're right, which is the problem with an arbitrary, like storage is very slow on the EVM, and it's how you store data. And it's very hard to know what you're going to touch ahead of executing it. And you can even try to provide me an access list, but like depending on the ordering of your transactions, that access list might be wrong, right? So you don't know who's going to touch stuff before you and how that's going to modify your execution. So this is just generally a very difficult problem, particularly just for a general like kind of settlement layer. I think like what I'm excited by are applications, and like in an application world, in theory, you can actually optimize some of this stuff because you know more about kind of the access pattern. And so I think that's an area that we love working with kind of our clients on, where we can kind of co-build kind of and kind of architect with you how to best take advantage of this new primitive. And if you were at Frontiers kind of a couple of weeks ago, which was great event hosted by Paradigm, the Rise chain, I believe, gave a great talk on kind of parallel EVM, and they've done a bunch of benchmarks. And I think historically for like Ethereum mainnet, I believe they were able to get like a 2x kind of parallel factor on execution, which is like, I mean, it's good, but it's not like, traditionally you would want to scale with the number of cores that your computer has, right? So like instead of a 2x, you would want to see like a 10x or like a 48x or something like that. And so like a 2x is really limiting. And that just kind of tells you like, this is the challenge of putting every single application on one chain, and having them all composed with each other is actually kind of the worst case for how do I make this go faster? It's kind of just like an impossible problem. And so I think for that reason, for a lot of other reasons, I think applications will, at least kind of the most ambitious ones, will kind of want their own chain. And they'll be able to customize it, they'll be able to design it, and take advantage of them knowing what's going to execute. And I think that will importantly enable like much higher gas throughput, and kind of better experiences on chain.
And part of designing it is deciding on its parallelization properties.
So I would say that today, like parallelization is probably in the background, where like, step one is let me just get an application on chain, the EVM is actually quite fast if can cache things in memory, and or like make modifications to know what you'll be able to access ahead of time. I think like parallel comes once you cap out like a single thread, and so you can do about 100 to 200 mgas a second, depending on like the workload and like your infrastructure setup and optimizations. And so once you need to go beyond that, I think parallel is actually kind of the next frontier. And, we'd like to work with the best teams trying to achieve that. And it really does come down to like, do you have the ambitions and like, how badly do you want to make it happen? Because it's very much kind of on the bleeding edge, and will involve a lot of work. And like, that's where, again, we're excited about customers like a proof of play. We're like, this is like the thing that they do. They need to scale Pirate Nation. The game works. People find it fun and like scale. And so working with them is incredible because like there's just such a tight loop there. And we know that the work we're investing is like going to actually make it into production. And so I think that's kind of the thing we're most excited about. Again, it's just finding these teams kind of on the frontier that want to push the limits and have a great kind of plan for how to, attract the demand for that much compute as well.
Yeah. If we kind of zoom out of parallelization for a second and think about the question of scaling more broadly, and I have this sequencer and I want it to max out the throughput to the extent that's possible, how would you sketch out the range of approaches, angles on that problem that you and other folks are like exploring right now? What's going to like, what's promising, what's going to bear fruit? How is this actually going to work?
Yeah. I think like a lot of folks are doing great work in the ecosystem. So like Aragon was probably, originally called TurboGeth, right? It was probably one of the original people that took like a performance-based approach towards running a node. And I think they have a lot of great things there. And then I would say almost the spiritual successor successor is probably the wrong word, but like, Reth is really interesting from a performance kind of perspective, and originally for L1 and now looking towards L2. And I think really I wouldn't say there's one thing. I would say there's the physics of the problem, which is you have this big state tree that goes only up over time and gets more expensive to access as like more stuff happens. And so I wouldn't say it's any one cut. I would say it's like probably like 1,000 incremental things that you need to work on. And in particular, I think one thing that we're excited about here at Conduit is just the kind of the fine tuning for a particular application. Because again, like when you're on your own chain, you can optimize for the specific kind of access patterns. And so something that we've worked closely with Proof of Play on is like, how do we tune this exact thing to your use case? Whereas like, again, on a generic settlement layer, like you kind of don't know what's going to happen. You can optimize it today for one thing, but like tomorrow it's going to be something different. And so
what does it mean to optimize it for the specific use case, like specifically?
Yeah, I mean, this goes into a lot of engineering and like algorithm stuff. I think like a big performance thing that comes up is like the database. And so like as the state size grows, eventually there will become a point where you have to go to disk, right? And like,
you can't store it in memory anymore.
You can't store it in memory anymore. It's like too expensive. Like if you look at Proof of Play, their archive state size is like 10 terabytes. And so like, I don't know if you can find a 10 terabyte memory instance on AWS. And even then, like it's growing at a rate where, it's going to outpace whatever hardware improvements we get there. And so I think like a lot of what we're doing is like, how do you optimize the database so that, as the state grows, you can kind of maintain the same amount of throughput. And it's a mix of algorithm stuff, but also like really low level database tuning. And maybe even one day, like, today Geth is using Level DB or like Pebble DB. Level DB, as far as I'm aware, is no longer maintained. Pebble DB is like, it's fine. But there are like next generation databases that are being created today. Like if you've heard of Firewood from Avalanche Labs, or even like Reth and Aragon are using this thing called M3 or MDBX or something like that, which are like next generation kind of databases. And
were these developed for blockchain use cases or outside of this, just in like general software database world?
So Firewood was, and then MDBX, I'm not sure if it was purpose built. I do know that that's where they've seen the most product market fit. So de facto, it's kind of like a blockchain database. But yeah, I think like you run into very obvious, like I think Ethereum, by staying at 1 to 2 million gas per second, has never had to run into these issues. But I think almost like immediately when you hit 50 million gas a second, you start getting these really bad kind of performance characteristics. And so I think for us, it's been like, having really good Web 2. It's almost like more of a Web 2 engineering challenge in combination with some of the Web 3 stuff. And going super deep on like optimizing, benchmarking, getting the right tunings, et cetera, to enable the kind of throughput that, we're doing today on production.
Yeah. What I am really curious about just the engineering of this, like what does it look like for you to be tuning this database? Like what does your kind of inside Conduit infra setup look like to kind of mock and kind of like test this setup?
Yeah, so I think this is, again, where just having the kind of most ambitious and best builders on Conduit is really helpful. Is like they give you the data set and they have the requirements that kind of push you forward. And so a lot of this tuning was just done on proof of play, and like syncing the chain, and trying to keep up with the head of the chain. And so when you have like a natural data set like that, it makes it really easy to kind of benchmark, at least for that specific use case. I think generally for us, again, because the EVM is a generic compute thing, and like you can even think about like in Web 2, right? Databases are also kind of a generic compute thing of like you can store kind of anything you want, and there are different access. It's like for each of these specific use cases, you're going to have to find a different tuning or a different kind of approach. And so we have a great one for the proof of play. The next one might look different, and then like eventually we'll want like a systemized process of like for these tuning. Are the kind of for tuning, like these are kind of the major kind of verticals of like access patterns, as we would call them. And like when we make database changes, like let's run that benchmark against all of them and just see where the performance stacks up.
That's cool. So is the right way of thinking about this that there's like execution, which is the parallelization stuff, and then there's the database, which is the tuning these different kind of new databases? What else goes into scaling NL2?
Yeah, well, without giving too much secret sauce, there are also like algorithmic changes that you can make to the EVM. And I think a lot of it has to do with just understanding, like, again, I'm there's no secret sauce here. I would say like the biggest thing is just to do the benchmarks, to do the profiling, and then to optimize from there. And like there's a lot of, and again, it's kind of specific to the use case. So what we do on like one customer might not be like what we need to do for another one. But generally, I think we found the deeper that you can kind of go on the EVM and the internals and how it works and finding the bottlenecks, the easier it is to design kind of algorithms and or even like making it its way to the application level of the smart contracts of how to best like utilize this. And so today, given the nascency of the bleeding edge, where like the compute is getting better and like, maybe, you might need to change how your application is designed to take advantage of it. I think, there's no silver bullet. And that's where I think just like working with us and like working in a tight loop is kind of the way to achieve that. And like, maybe I'll give one example here of like, storage is a really big one where like certain contracts on certain chains might have like, you can technically have like infinite storage in a contract. And that actually tends to be really bad performance wise because you just have this like gigantic amount of state and then it's only growing over time. And then even for like an archive state, like, you need to store that multiple times. And so one thing, kind of maybe a more obvious change is like you probably want to shard out your contract state, not just for parallelism, but just for being able to take advantage of kind of these different kind of caching mechanisms. And so if you have one contract that has like all the state in the world, that's going to be kind of hard to scale. So that's like one area that we're kind of going back to teams on, and like is important from a parallel perspective, and a like eventually like this will kind of be a challenge to scale.
So a team would ideally start thinking about scaling and talking with you guys and like thinking about the roll-up architecture when they're actually architecting their application. Like it's part of the same process ultimately.
The earlier the better, because once you have your smart contract and application built, it's going to be extra work to change it. And I think like where we've had the most success is where we get like kind of embedded with you in the process early, and we can help guide how to build that kind of on chain. And frankly, those are some of the customers that we're most excited by. It's like they have these ambitious goals and like can definitely kind of deliver on the GTM. And now we just got to figure out how to make it work.
Right. There's probably some version of, start with doing unscalable things, like just build the MVP, see if you can get to product market fit, and then for V2, like design with scaling in mind.
I think there's a bit of that. And then I think like the customers that we're most excited by here, in some ways already have the PMF and they're hitting like the scaling challenges of like, we either like, we have this in a Web 2 way, right, where it's off chain today, and then like we periodically settle on chain. But there's a very obvious like we want to take this activity and put it on chain, or it's something like or it's something like we're rate limiting the number of users that can actually use it because we know we're running into these gas lines, and so help us actually bring more users on by scaling. Versus kind of like limiting what we can actually build here.
Into the Bytecode is sponsored by Splits. Are you tired of sacrificing security for usability? Splits believes it's still way too hard for teams to self-custody their on-chain assets. They're building a new kind of internet-native bank on top of Ethereum. Splits makes it easy for teams to manage the whole lifecycle of their finances, from structuring revenue sharing agreements, using payment flows like splits and waterfalls, to managing those earnings once you receive them, using passkeys and smart accounts. Splits is being used by teams like Protocol Guild, Zora, Songcamp, and others. I'm a big believer in them and recommend checking them out. You can learn more at splits.org. Yeah. Okay, maybe switching gears to interoperability. And I'm curious if you can just explain to me how you think interoperability is going to work. So today we're kind of in this moment in time where there are many, many layer 2s. Each user has a different wallet, different set of assets on each of them. We kind of use either the canonical bridges to move between them or things like a cross where, a kind of solver of sorts goes and gives the asset to us more immediately on the other side for a small fee. But I feel like this is all kind of temporary, right? And a lot of the parts of the stack are kind of moving and shifting. Like even Optimism, Superchain kind of announced shared their interoperability spec a couple of weeks ago. So as someone who's kind of working on this and across these different rollups, what is this going to look like, do you think?
Yeah. I understand the desire for interoperability. I just think like it's, I think, and maybe this is a spicy take, I think like most of what people want when they say interoperability is like, I want to be able to easily, I'm on like this app on this chain, I want to easily use this app on another chain, and I don't really want to have to think about it. And I think if we can solve that, that's like 99.99% of like what needs to be done. And then I think like, it's kind of about like what trade-off do you want to make to achieve more than that, right? And so like in some ways, third-party bridging, yes, there's a ton of fragmentation. There's a lot of different like bridges, and they have different security properties. I think that maybe mostly gets figured out in the market over the next few years. And I almost wonder, like, in the same way that like global composability is something that people talk about, I almost wonder if like almost in some ways like global composability means that you are kind of the same app, if that makes sense. Or like maybe should be the same app. And I think like if you look at Web 2, like there's not a ton of like composability between like major verticals because they're quite differentiated, right? You might share some data here or there, but it's not like it's the dominant access pattern. And I think when you're talking about moving at like assets and stuff like that, they're obviously like DeFi. It can be great to be composable. But if I look at kind of the landscape today, it's almost like you have Ethereum, where obviously a lot of liquidity lives, and then you have Arbitrum One, which kind of is the dominant settlement layer for DeFi on layer twos. And then interoperability, it's going to be good. Even in the superchain case, like we're very excited for it. I think it's going to be low cost and it's going to enable easier asset bridging. I don't know that it's going to give you the same level of composability that, being actually on the same layer entails. And so I think over time, like these layers differentiate to the point where like, is a user on Pirate Nation going to want to atomically, open a loot box with like depositing into like a Lyra vault or something, right? I just don't know if that is actually going to be the dominant use case, but that also seems to be what a lot of crypto Twitter or like a lot of protocol designers seem to be optimizing for. And I almost wonder if it's kind of a premature optimization for a problem that doesn't exist quite yet. And like, I think the dominant, it feels to me, access pattern here is going to be, I'm on one chain, I want to easily, or like I'm on an app on one chain, I want to easily use an app on some other chain and not really have to think about it. And I think like tooling here is starting to get actually much, much better.
How does that particular case work?
So, I'm just going to call it like a Privy, for example. I think recently integrated like Relay. And Relay is a, bridging partner that we work closely with. They do a lot of cool stuff. But the idea is like, if you can kind of in the background easily, log in somewhere and then just like use another app and like not think about it. Maybe it's a one-click transfer or something like that. I think that starts to reduce the friction to a point where, today, I guess like without that, it's like, oh, I'm on this chain. I need to know about the chain. I need to find the bridge to the other chain. I need to bridge across. I need to wait like 5 minutes, hope it goes through, and then maybe I can use this other app. Whereas I think this new product experience is like, oh, I can just one click start using this other app somewhere if it's on a different chain, and I don't have to think about it. And so ultimately, it needs to be abstracted away. And there will be maybe a cost associated with that. I think given the amount of competition and just how much is happening, I think those costs kind of really go down over time. And I think that, again, it's maybe similar to like, I just need to log into a new app, right? Or like anytime I use a new thing, I need to add my payment credentials. So there's a similar amount of friction there. But just being able to one click, again, bridge into another app on another chain, I think is getting pretty close to like the ideal user experience.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, another question I have is around economics. So do you think of rollups as primarily like a scaling technology, or do you also think there's something important there about how it changes the economics of running an application and like kind of opens up a different business model to developers? How do you think about that prompt?
100%. I feel like you've been listening to my content. But no, I think it's a great point. Yeah, I mean, I think like, again, I don't know that apps like proof of play would be possible on somebody else's chain. They've actually gone through a very interesting evolution where they started out on Polygon. Again, it's fine for like low transaction volumes, but got expensive and there's congestion. They moved to Arbitrum Nova, where they became 40% or more of the TPS and started hitting the point where they're the ones increasing the congestion on the chain, and so they're bidding against themselves. That's only getting more expensive. And in one day they spent something like $70K. And on their own chain, it's like, well, actually, I own the chain, and so like the fees can go back to myself. And really, all the on-chain fees I'm paying are the settlement costs, right? Which can be quite cheap, particularly for like an alt-DA chain. And And so I think that uniquely enables the business model to the point where you can treat a rollup as your own server versus using someone else's chain as like a very, very expensive AWS or something, right? Where they have a different business model because they're it's this open public write only database, and they're storing that data forever, and like their decentralization reasons, everybody needs to be able to run a node. So if we don't make it expensive enough, then we're going to get spammed, etc. Whereas I think on your own chain, maybe there's still the spam problem. I just think there's probably a lack of people caring, and you can even raise fees to the point where you kind of combat spam. But like the important thing is like the fees roll back to you, right? So if proof of play is kind of driving a lot of the transactions for the game with relayers, then like the fees just go back to the relayers, which allows them to actually have this like circular system where the on-chain fees are basically negligible. And so I think
the
that
relayers,
really,
what are the relayers here?
so the relayers would be like if I log into the game, I kind of sign something that enables, so like when I open a loot box or something, that triggers a transaction on chain that comes back and like opens my loot box for me or something. And so it's kind of one of the ways you can get a gasless experience on chain for their users.
This is like account abstraction type stuff.
Exactly. So I think that ultimately, like bringing that what would have been like, especially as they scaled, right, just kind of this variable cost that would have bankrupted them, has now become like a Conduit kind of hosted fee for the infrastructure and like a very minimal kind of on-chain kind of cost footprint. And so, I think actually proof of play and the business models uniquely enabled kind of by their own roll up. And I think a lot of people are starting to see that where, particularly if you want, it's not just like more gas, but it's like, if I were to pay for that much gas on someone else's chain, I would go bankrupt like very, very quickly. And so in some ways, it's becoming the only kind of model for application specific rollups that want to push the limits.
Yeah, that makes sense. So are they running, is Conduit running the relayers, or they're kind of incentivizing an open kind of network of relayers and they're just paying them out of the transaction fees that their sequencer gets?
So proof of play runs the relayers today. And in theory, that can be like decentralized, right? All you're doing for a relayer is actually just you're taking kind of like the signed kind of permissions from the client and then translating that or like sending that on chain. So it's actually like a pretty minimal kind of process. Over time, for things like PPP and like even their cross chain stuff, right, will eventually kind of be more decentralized. I think again, where we're starting today is like a little more pragmatic and making sure that the game works and like the user experience is good, and then eventually getting to a point where all of this is kind of like fully decentralized. And there's some exciting things there around interoperability, particularly on like, I guess on the, so they're on the Arbitrum Nitro stack. And so there's some interesting things around like fast withdrawals and being able to, send messages kind of across chains in a way that, is faster, that can help enable some of this a little more seamlessly. But gotta walk before we can run and ensure that the customers have a good experience, and then like building into that later.
Mm-hmm. So if I think about the economics of a rollup, in some ways you can think of the kind of transaction fees and maybe MEV as the revenue, and then the costs of data availability, settlement as the expenses, right? And the difference between the two is what you make as a sequencer. Is that how you would think about it? And do you think, given, is this a real lasting thing, or does competition kind of drive these revenues down to the bare minimum that they can be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the revenue models are going to be different depending on the chain. And I would say like looking at even the proof of play use case, right? If you look at their settlement fees, basically negligible. And then you could imagine like sequencer revenues probably negligible too, right? And so the revenue model there isn't the sequencer fees. It's actually going to be maybe more of the, for lack of a better term, like the Web 2 kind of SaaS side of things, right? It's like we have some unique technology that enables them to go fast and to maintain that throughput. We obviously have a bunch of other infrastructure surrounding that like kind of power the game. And I almost think that like when we look at like fees, I almost think that like that's not the greatest long-term model, because like if you look at Ethereum during the bull, it's like extracting these gigantic fees, but that's just clearly not sustainable, right? And I think the end game for crypto is like we have sustainable, kind of almost like quote unquote boring businesses on chain that just kind of do their thing and generate revenues. Whereas I think traditionally it's always been like, oh, like this, what is the next thing I can dump my money into to like maybe get a 10 or 100x, and that making me very price insensitive towards like what the fees are, right? And I think realistically, like the speculative process is an important part of developing the infrastructure, getting interest, getting capital and builders into the ecosystem. It's not going to be a long-term, it can't be the dominant thing. Let me put it that way forever. And so in that world, I think like what we're doing is in some ways disrupting kind of the current metagame of how you think about things, where even for an Arbitrum One or like an Optimism or a base, like the dominant model is I want to extract revenue from our users for paying for transactions, right? And I think if you want to build cool things on chain and like reach the next level, I actually think you have to invert that. And it's like you want to make that basically free. You want to minimize kind of your on-chain footprint cost, while enabling the type of scalability and throughput to actually build unique experiences that can onboard people that aren't going to go into DeFi or aren't going to go into these other things. And in some ways, like not saying the blockchain shouldn't exist or it shouldn't be obvious, but like kind of fading into the background where you have these like strong guarantees, but it feels kind of just like a standard Web 2 application.
Yeah, totally. It's like your margin is my opportunity type situation, where even if one kind of layer 2 doesn't reduce its fees, the other L2s can, and they can attract use cases that are made possible, add more scale, add lower fees. And there's a kind of like battle of network effects and kind of winning different segments of applications and users, which probably, trends the fees to lower and lower amounts. All right, I got a couple more fun personal questions to close, if you're good with that. So first one is, you've been working in the Valley and in tech for some time. I'm curious, what kind of differences have you noticed as you've kind of started working in crypto? Like from a cultural perspective, like the good and the bad. Like what are the kind of things that have stood out to you?
Yeah, crypto is a very interesting industry. I would say that I really like working in an industry that is on the frontier and the bleeding edge and changes very rapidly and is dynamic. And you kind of don't really get that as much in Web 2, unless like I think the recent AI stuff might be a little bit different. But like for a long time, right, it was just like how do I build a B2B SaaS kind of company? And is there like a tiny sliver of a vertical I can like kind of cut off here? And ultimately that wasn't like super interesting. And so I think in contrast with crypto, I think in some way, like good and bad thing about the industry, it's like very hard to know where it's going to go, right? Like, and I think even when I started the company, it's like a month or two later, FTX happened, right? And I'm trying to hire our first engineer or something, and then FTX happens, and he's like, "Oh, this whole industry is a scam. Fuck this." And I'm like, "Oh shit." Well, and so I think there's the dynamicness and kind of the freedom of it that's like really interesting. And like one of the reasons that I like continuing to build here is like you're on the frontier and you don't know what's going to happen, and you have an opportunity to help shape that. I would say some of the things that were surprising to me, and I think are really just I would say are more of a, like, we're kind of still a nascent industry, is that, I think there are a lot of like mission driven or like a lot of ideologues, for lack of a better word. And I think that can be useful for things, but we also have to circle back and identify, like, are those same ideologies still serving us? And like, are there ways that we can improve as an industry to increase adoption, to ultimately get this freedom technology into more hands and to be kind of more useful. And I think like that, certainly when we're starting, that was a challenging aspect. But I think like the industry has gotten more mature. I think like our product and tech is getting out there. I think a common refrain we used to get a lot was like, isn't a rollup just centralized? And like, I think there have been a lot of improvements in kind of the decentralization aspect, where Optimism has fault proofs and it can be permissionless. Arbitrum obviously has kind of always had those and is launching permissionless fault proofs. And so there's a little bit of like, this is centralized today and like it's never going to work. And like, well, we're, the tech it's complicated and like we're going to get there. And ultimately it's going to be how we're going to scale Ethereum. So there's always a little bit of that. And then I think something that is very different from traditional tech is, I think, how fast people can quote unquote get rich. I mean, this happens in Web 2 as well. And like, you might've seen that in the recent AI craze, but I think the level to which like economics influence things, and there's kind of a lot of noise because of that, is uncommon, I would say, and is kind of a unique characteristic of crypto, where I ultimately think like one thing that I kind of strongly believe is that over time, like, I think the people who are able to navigate that and understand that, yes, incentives are one thing, but probably not the main thing that's going to make me successful. And then to choose, the kind of pragmatic and things that are going to give them the best chance of success. And in some ways, like delaying that gratification for kind of the bigger kind of pie later on. I think those are the customers that we're excited to work with, and ultimately, in our experience, have really built the best products and experiences. The ones who are kind of focused on building, and that is again a super unique thing where I think sometimes we have the 10x better product, we're kind of better, and then like there will be a big token grant somewhere else, and then they'll kind of like go that direction. And so there's not always anything you can do in those scenarios, but it is something that at least in kind of my experience is quite unique to crypto. And I think as a founder, you just have to be aware of that and kind of not just understand like it's kind of part of the game.
The last kind of fun question is, we have a mutual friend in Georgios, and I think you guys have worked together pretty closely on things over time. And I'm curious how you would describe Georgios to someone who doesn't know him, maybe. And then what have you learned from him as an engineering leader, as anyone, as like a person also?
Yeah. Georgios is incredible. He's, I would say he is probably one of the sharpest kind of technical people in crypto that deeply understands the tech at a granularity that actually means like, he knows what he's talking about. And that is actually, like, you'd be surprised. Actually, a lot of people kind of don't know what they're talking about. And so he's consistently somebody that, I can call on if I need to, talk through something kind of on the engineering side of things. I think like what I've been most impressed with is his like growth. So I think, when we first, maybe I've told this story before, but like when we first met, he had, just come back from Burning Man. He actually had broken his ankle doing a wheelie and had to get like trucked out of there. I was starting my EIR actually at Paradigm. And so I would actually go visit him in his apartment where he would be stuck in the attic because he could barely walk around. I would go whatever, fetch water for him because like he couldn't walk. And then like we would like start jamming. And I think now, like almost 2 years later, I think like he's, I would say like much more measured, and I think kind of like in control, for lack of a better word. And he's always been a very passionate guy. And I think that's a lot of what's driven him and kind of how he's gotten to where he is today. And I think what I've been most impressed by with him is like how he's been able to kind of transform into, somebody much more measured and kind of able to navigate things kind of more skillfully. So really been a pleasure working with him. And he's been an important part. I think like what he's doing with Reth is pretty incredible. I think there's probably one person in crypto who could have pulled that off. And, we're very lucky that he decided to do it. I think generally just across the ecosystem, he's made like incredible contributions. And I think, we're very lucky to kind of have him.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that story. I didn't know that he broke his ankle while doing a wheelie. It kind of explains a lot, I guess.
It's a very Georgios way to be introduced to him. And I think I don't know if you like he's also very into anime. And so during that time, obviously stuck on the couch, kind of introduced me to anime. And I think we watched all 3 Neon Genesis Evangelion movies, I think back to back until like 3 a.m. or something. And this was like probably the 10th time he was watching it all the way through. But
what's the pitch on that? Why should I watch that? What's the story?
NG, honestly, I was pretty tired, so I don't know if I was like processing everything, but I think it was. I think the animation was great. The kind of plot lines were very complex, and I think Georgios has gone really deep on like the analysis of it and like kind of the kind of themes and everything. I think I was just trying to keep up, and so. He's probably the better person to ask about that.
Yeah. All right, man. I think we can call it there.
Cool, man.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
Hey, I have a small ask here. If you've been listening to these conversations and want to support what we're doing here, I would really appreciate if you leave a rating and a review for the podcast. It might seem like a small thing, but it actually makes a big difference to help other people discover the show also. Thank you. And I'll see you again soon.